Episode 122 of Off Script with Trish Close, intimate interviews with interesting people. Joining me today via Skype, I have Professor Jeffrey Pilcher. Hello, Jeffrey Pilcher. How are you today?
Hi, I'm well, thank you.
Well, thanks for being here. You are professor at the University of Toronto, professor of food history, and author of several books. I just want to read a couple of these. My listeners have probably read them. Que vivan los tamales, Food and the Making of Mexican Identity, Sausage Rebellion, Public Health, Private Enterprise, and Meat in Mexico City. That one came out in 2006. Food in World History, and your latest book, I believe, this may be outdated, Planet Taco, A Global History of Mexican Food. That came out in 2012.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I have so many questions for you. First of all, Professor, where are you from originally?
Originally from the area around Chicago, so I'm kind of a Midwesterner, and just moved to Canada 6 years ago.
And you moved to Canada just to teach, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I took the job here, but actually, it's kind of a family history of moving back and forth across the Canadian border. I'm the third generation of my family to have done that, so it's kind of.
Really? What?
Yeah.
What were other folks in your family doing?
So my grandfather was a doctor and moved to Canada to practice, and then my father moved back to the United States. He was also a college professor, and then so when I got this job, I was kind of like, oh, that's nice.
You're following in those footsteps. Is there obviously a love of both places, Canada and United States?
Yeah. I mean, and so these last 6 years has really been, I mean, I'd been to Canada before, but I mean, it's sort of getting to know the country and becoming a citizen and all that stuff. So yeah, it's really been, it's been a nice journey of discovery and so yeah.
So you are a Canadian then?
I am Canadian now.
Okay, all right, I like it. Let's talk about food. Was food important in your family growing up?
I'm from a Midwestern family, and I mean, food wasn't unimportant, but it wasn't terribly exciting, shall we say. It was, your basic kind of Midwestern fare, but I was always very interested in food. And so, it's in retrospect, it's not surprising that I became a food historian. It's just that I kind of got off to a slow start in discovering the worlds of food that are out there.
You said you've always been interested in food. How so?
Well, I just, kind of remember that, when we would go out to restaurants, I would be deeply interested in the menu and kind of what are these things, and it was always sort of a discovery, and so yeah, I think I've just always been very interested in food, but there was not a lot of there to discover.
A little workplace confession: when I have a few minutes of downtime, I look up menus online. Like a nerd, and just read them.
And actually, I've done a lot of research in menus myself, and sort of writing the books, sort of what kinds of foods were available, and that it's a very, very interesting documents. And now that they're available in such numbers, it's really become an opportunity to do a lot of research in menus, and so yeah.
So in school, what were you studying? What were your plans for the future?
So in college, I was actually a mathematics and computer science major. This was back in the day when actually my first computer class was done on punch cards, and so yeah, no, it was like dinosaur age computers.
Perfect. So why food then, specifically history of food? What made you decide this is the path I need to take?
I mean, I was interested in history and started taking, after college, I just started taking classes in history because it was fun. And then eventually, sort of gave up the computer job, which wasn't as much fun, to get a PhD in history. But at the time, that there was really, I mean, food history was not a serious academic subject, and and the idea that I could actually write my dissertation on the history of Mexican food was really quite remarkable at the time. Yeah, it was fortuitous that I was able to bring my interests together in that way.
Why Mexican food?
So again, it was a sort of a fortuitous thing. And actually, I like so I'll tell a little story about how I really discovered Mexican food. Because I mean, I think I had been to Taco Bell maybe once. And certainly, my mother had, would occasionally buy those little taco shell things, and you put the hamburger and the lettuce and
Yeah, I
tomato and
call those
cheese in it.
old school tacos.
Yeah, well, yeah, so, I mean, I must have had those a few times. I mean, I kind of have these vague memories of them, but I'd never really had Mexican food. But my brother, who had gone off to college in New Mexico, had married a Mexican American woman. And so the very first time was actually at the wedding rehearsal. And what I had was, uh, um, really, it was just your very basic gorditas, right? These little corn, kind of like pita, stuffed with, really just some hamburger and lettuce, but with a salsa. And it was one of those salsas. Well, so I like to think of this as kind of like my Buddha moment. So the story of the Buddha, right? That when he's a child, his father kind of puts him in this very enclosed space so that he won't actually see that the world is full of suffering. And so it's like he's grown up and married before he actually sees somebody who's sick and somebody who's old and somebody dies. And so and that is the moment of the Buddha's enlightenment, is that he realizes that the world is suffering because he had never actually seen it before. And then he can kind of, has that by suddenly being confronted with. And so in the same way, I'd never really discovered taste before. And there I was, eating this salsa that caused steam to come boiling out my ears. And it was like, oh my God, there's flavor out there in this world, and I'd never known it before. And so it was one of those kind of moments where it was this enlightenment that there's food.
Yeah, your taste buds were literally like, what is this?
Exactly. Actually, I'm kind of a family legend. I had my head stuck under the faucet, kind of the water pouring out.
That's so
I'm from
great. I
the
love that.
Midwest. We did like chili was not, like a food group in our family. And so,
For
but
sure.
since then I've actually, I've really come to love Mexican food and eat chili quite regularly. But it was just this very almost, moment of enlightenment.
Hmm. Was that really your aha moment? Did that spark a lot of things for you?
Well, I mean, it was an aha moment. And actually, sort of the Mexican history part was completely different. It was just that in graduate school, I just that the coolest professor there was a Mexican historian. I thought, oh, this is really cool. But it wasn't even until many years later that I realized, what, I could do the history of Mexican food and bring those two together. But yeah, so it was just one of those sort of uh, crazy life sort of wandering. I mean, how some people are determined, they know what they're going to do and they spend their entire. No, I was just kind of wandering around, just aimlessly and happened into what turned out to be a really great job, I have to say.
Amazing. Well, you're obviously smart. I mean, you were going into this field, you thought that, I mean, you can't be dumb to do that. And so I guess I'm just curious, the things that changed for you when you were like, mathematics, not for me, but food history. Were you just really going I need to know more. I need to know where this comes from.
Well, I mean, once again, it was one of those things where I didn't really know what I was doing. There was a kind of a moment when I realized first that you don't actually have to take mathematics. This was kind of when you're in school, you take math. That's one of those things that you take.
Yeah.
And I just kept taking the classes. But then I reached a point at which that I realized I was not a mathematician. That, I mean, mathematicians are really smart people, or at least they live in their heads in ways that I do not. And so I kind of realized that this was not actually going to happen for me. And so and I was just having a lot more fun with history, and so it just kind of wandered off that way.
Sure. So you write this dissertation. When was that?
So that was in 1993 when I finished up graduate school.
Okay. Did the dissertation turn into the book? Obviously, with
Yeah,
all the
that was the basis for the book. And it's actually really quite remarkable how closely. So I wrote a 10-page, conference paper that really laid out the book in remarkable detail. So it would have been, 1992, I suppose. 1991, 92, something like that. And it was just, it's amazing how, kind of wandered around for a while, but then came right back to that initial 10-page paper. And so, yeah.
Let's talk about the book you wrote in 1998, Que Vivan los Tamales. So this is food and the making of Mexican identity. Did tamales specifically have a lot to do with that?
Well, yeah. So tamales were sort of the indigenous festival food par excellence, and when you look at the codices, the early documents of Mexican food, that they describe all kinds of tamales, and so like lobster tamales and all of these crazy recipes that sound really good.
Yeah.
And yet, when I started looking at the early cookbooks, which really did not start coming, they really weren't published until the 19th century. They didn't really have very many recipes for tamales. And in fact, one of the cookbooks even said, why would anybody, decent families, eat these indigenous foods, right? Because, the Spanish conquest, the idea was that European foods were high status and good, and that it was Indians who ate these kinds of foods. And it's a little more complicated than that, but it was really quite striking the ways in which you had these two different culinary traditions, the indigenous based on corn, and then the Spanish based on wheat. And they really were kind of this clash of civilizations almost in the kitchen. And in fact, you had these women in the kitchen who were combining the ingredients and making, what comes to be modern Mexican food. But it was looked down on for a very long time. And really, even to this day, if you go onto a fancy restaurant in Mexico, they have to put wheat bread on the table because otherwise it's just not considered to be a real meal.
Wow. Were they at odds with that whole corn versus wheat? Because I was going to ask you about corn. Corn really is the basis of so many, foods if you look back, even in the United States. But was it something like, well, we use corn as the basis for most of our meals and we use wheat? Was there clashing?
Oh, there absolutely was. And I mean, it was a really religious at some levels because the Indians worshipped corn gods. And of course, wheat was the only grain that could be used for the Catholic Eucharist, right? The body of Christ. And so there was this very fundamental clash at a level of religion, at the level of the economy, that they sort of used the land to stop planting corn, start planting wheat to try to, as part of the conquest, to take over the resources, dispossessing the Indians from their land. But then there was also just taste that the early accounts, the conquistadors hated corn. They did not like the taste of corn, and the Indians did not like the taste of wheat bread. Again, going back to the chronicles, they describe the bread of the conquistadors as being like famine food, like eating a corn stalk, not the actual corn, but the stalk, which is something you'd feed to animals. And so there was just this ongoing struggle between the two.
We were picky back then.
Oh, absolutely. Now, people have been picky. I think, this whole myth, that like ancient hunter-gatherers ate everything. No, they didn't. I mean, they were as much as snobs as we are now, I think. And I mean, it's kind of hard to tell what they were eating and why they were making those decisions. But I think taste is a fundamental part of the human nature, and that those kinds of food choices are made. That I mean, this idea of we are what we eat is not just to like civilization. That this is a basic human thing, and that really the ability to pick foods, to eat different things, it drove human evolution for millions of years.
Fascinating. That makes me feel better about myself that I probably do come from a long line of food snobs. So I feel a lot better about that.
I think it's just, being human.
Okay. Whew, thank goodness. Did they ever come together? Was there ever a, hey, we can have both? This corn
Oh,
wheat?
sure, there was, and it's in the 20th century that they kind of sort of actually do as sort of a national ideology say, yes, we're the people who eat both, and there's a kind of a politics there as well, that's kind of long and complicated, but the sort of trying to say, okay, what is it to be a Mexican, and it's not being an Indian or a Spaniard. And that's when they kind of come up with that idea. Oh, we're the people who eat both. But even to this day, right? There's still those kinds of colonial era stereotypes and kinds of looking down the nose at the indigenous populations.
Okay, let's talk about the Sausage Rebellion, public health, private enterprise, meat in Mexico City. This book instantly reminded me of, I believe it's Upton Wells, the
Upton Sinclair, yeah, the
Upton
jungle,
Sinclair.
and
Thank you, the jungle.
that is absolutely what it was. It was a kind of a Mexican jungle, and it was in fact meat packers from the United States who go down to try to set up their kind of approach to Mexico, and the Mexican butchers fight back because butchers they can be tough guys.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the Upton Sinclair book that actually changed practices in the United States of how we take care of all food, really, milk, meat, and really health inspections in a lot of these facilities. So obviously, if you're looking at some of these facilities in Mexico, were they just in desperate need of regulation?
That's a funny thing because I actually went to the meat market. It had already closed. So there was a change that happened really only in the 1990s.
Wow.
And the meat market that had originally been there, they were no longer doing the slaughter there, but they were still, had this meat market. And I was blown away at how fresh that meat was there. I mean, it was beautiful. It was like going to like a Japanese fish market. It was not at all what I was expecting. I was expecting this kind of, ghastly thing, and I was just like, holy cow, you might want to eat this. And admittedly, I mean, the supply chains break down, and it can be difficult to get water and all these other kinds of things. But I was really struck at that these were not the kinds of ghastly spaces that I was imagining. Now, that was admittedly after the slaughter had happened, and let's face it, there is just no way of making a pretty face on a slaughterhouse. I mean, it's just
It is what it is, for sure.
if you're gonna eat meat, somebody has got to be in there and with animals dying, and that's just all there is to it.
Right. Yeah, 100%. So let's talk about Mexican food coming into the United States. Obviously, as people move in, they bring the things that they love with them, and a huge portion of that is what they do and eat around the dinner table. And you could say that for all sorts of different cultures. But when do we, as Americans in the United States, start seeing Mexican food?
Yeah, so one thing you have to remember is, because you started this by saying when people move in. And what you have to remember is that Texas and California were Mexican before they were American.
Right.
And it was actually, these illegal immigrants like Sam Houston and Stephen Austin who were discovering Mexican food that had been there for centuries. And so it's when the big time discovery of Mexican food happens in the 1880s when the railroad arrives, and you have tourists arriving at places like San Antonio and Los Angeles in a big way. And so one of the early images that Americans have of Mexican food comes from street vendors in the city of San Antonio, Texas, who became known as the Chili Queens. And you know, I mean, they're just like, you know, street vendors anywhere. They would set up their stands and sell their chili stews, enchiladas, and all this other kind of stuff. Um, and and there was a lot of ambivalence about that, right? And it was partly about, you know, this is a sanitation thing, and you know, so street vendors are always kind of suspect in American eyes, and but there was also a real racial issue as well. Because here, you know, these mixed race Mexicans, they weren't, you know, pure white Europeans. And so there was, and there's a kind of a sexual danger that these women were seemingly, you know, representing. And when you read the descriptions of these, they're highly sexualized, right? That you know, if you're a tourist in San Antonio, you have to go and have your, you know, you have to talk to the chili queens and taste their foods, but it was always sort of in this kind of dangerous environment. And this was, you know, kind of one of the ways in which the United States was discovering the Mexican heritage of the land that had been conquered, you know, from Mexico in the 1840s. And so it was, you know, instead of these women come to stand in this kind of southwestern mythology for Mexicans, right? They're not men, they're women, and somehow that makes it less dangerous.
So
I
these
mean, you know, there's just a lot of kind of issues there, just like, you know, all racial issues
For sure.
always very fraught.
These tourists were sort of thinking, I'm going to visit this street vendor and I'm living on the edge if I get one of these tamales.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it, right? You know, that it's hot food, you know, and there's the danger of, you know, something that's going to scorch your taste buds, but it's also, you know, it's going to make you, you know, yeah, it was living on the edge. It was safe danger, you know, it's kind of slummy.
Right. And so talk about, I mean, because in the book you talk about the two real, I guess, hot spots, for lack of a better word, which was in Texas and then in LA, Houston, right? Or was it San Antonio?
So it's in Los Angeles and in San Antonio, Texas. Yeah.
So these two spots essentially explode, really, right? With this love of Mexican food, and more people are discovering what it is. More and more people are wanting to have it close by.
Yeah, although you got to remember that, and this is often the case with, you know, sort of ethnic foods, is that they become adapted to Anglo tastes. You know, so it's the combination plate for people who don't really, you know, it's the taco shells for people who can't eat with the tortilla. I mean, you know, there's all these ways that, you know, and it's just like chopsticks for Chinese food, and, you know, spaghetti for Italian immigrants. All of these ways in which, you know, kind of Americans try to, you know, make these foreign foods, which are exotic and appealing and all that stuff, but they're also maybe a little dangerous, and so they have to be kind of Americanized, sanitized to make it safe for Americans.
Is that a bad thing?
Ah, now that is a very big question. And, you know, today when we, you know, get into all these debates about appropriation and all of these things, you know, it's a very complicated question. And I certainly do understand people, Mexicans, who are offended by the ways that Taco Bell, you know, kind of represents Mexicans, you know, depicting them as dogs, and, you know, and so, yeah, I totally get that notion. And yet, for those Mexican American entrepreneurs who were, you know, running these restaurants and who were adapting their recipes in order to appeal to consumers outside of the immigrant community or the ethnic communities, the Mexican community, then I'm less willing to sort of call them traders, because they're business people. They're trying to make a buck, and anytime that you discover a new food, you're going to make it your own. I mean, that sort of process of localization, of changing the recipe to fit your taste, is just another one of those things that humans do. Right? We have our own ideas of how things should taste, and we want to adjust it. If that's only, putting a little salt and pepper on it because, it's not quite to our taste. I mean, that's just what cooks do and what diners do, is they, want things to taste the way they expect. And so, this whole, and I mean, really the history of Mexican food is about, kind of these accommodations of different cultures, right? The Spanish and the indigenous peoples. And then the long lines of migrants who have come to Mexico, from African slaves to Chinese who migrated in large numbers in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and so all of these Lebanese and so on, people who have become Mexican and have contributed to Mexico's development, the same way that migrants in the United States have contributed to the ways that we eat.
For sure. I was just going to mention, I've interviewed Italian-American chef Lidia Bastianich, and she talked about when she opened a restaurant in New York, she was cooking, there were a lot of great restaurants, she said, that were cooking that sort of Italian-American fare. She was bringing in dishes that she remembered her grandmother making, and dishes from her family that a lot of the people in that neighborhood hadn't tried. So essentially, she says she was educating her neighbors about Italian food. And I think that's the beauty, right, of having all of these different cultures here. We're learning so much. And I do appreciate you bringing up, that really does bring it into perspective when you think about these entrepreneurs that are trying to open a restaurant. What are they going to do? They're going to appeal to the people who are in that neighborhood who want to eat there. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I mean, we see this same thing happening with Mexicans today, where migrants who are coming from Mexico and coming from regions that we don't know, with these different cuisines, because Mexico is a very diverse regional cuisines, like Italy. And so, just like the Italian dishes that, Lidia Bastianich's grandmother is bringing, those are not the ones that were in whatever her neighborhood was. And so, kind of discovering these things is a wonderful opportunity to just, and in the same way with these Mexican dishes that were not part of that sort of northern Mexican, Texas, California cuisine that sort of becomes our image of Mexican American food. And yet, there's a kind of a valorization of that kind of authentic cuisine, which then leads us to ignore or even to kind of look down our nose at those taco shells, for example, because there's a story about Glenn Bell, right, the founder of Taco Bell, how he supposedly invented the taco shell. But of course, he didn't do that. I mean, Mexican Americans had been cooking that for decades, and it was just the Mexican American taco, with its hamburger, tomato, lettuce, cheese. I mean, those are just the ingredients that are available in the U.S. supermarkets. That's what Mexican American women were cooking with, and so Glenn Bell didn't invent that. He basically just sold it to a kind of a mass audience. And so if we just kind of completely say that all Mexican American food is bad, then we're writing those people out of our history, out of our cuisine. And sure, there's a lot of bad food. I mean, there's bad food everywhere. But to sort of just say they're not real, they're not authentic, is, I think, doing a disservice to those people who really established the idea that Mexicans are in fact citizens, right? I mean, they were pioneers of the civil rights in the same ways that, pioneers of African American civil rights activists were. And I think we should, respect them as such.
Right. In fact, right here, as late as the 1960s, tacos were virtually unknown outside Mexico and the American Southwest. Within 50 years, the United States had shipped taco shells everywhere from Alaska to Australia, Morocco to Mongolia. So I guess what is it about this specific cuisine, as I'm sure you could say for others, that just we fell in love with? Everyone.
Well, yeah, so I think it's in part the same reason I fell in love with it, right? Is that it's spicy, it's hot, it's these flavors that were not well known in, that were not present in the kind of Midwestern food I grew up eating. And I think that's, I mean, today we eat so much salsa, we eat so much of these, kinds of foods, and because again, I think that, humans like flavor, and that appeal to it, and the appeal of societies, of cuisines, where they still kind of have these really that was much of it. It was just this kind of human desire for those kinds of tastes, and that pursuit, our looking for those foods
Gotcha.
is a big part of it. Yeah, so that's I think that's what it is.
Do you think we have changed a little bit in the last, I don't know, couple of decades, where we're in search for more authenticity when it comes to our food?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I mean, when you think about, the audience that people like Anthony Bourdain,
Mm-hmm.
rest in peace,
Yeah.
and not, I mean, he was a part of that, but I think it was a much bigger than him. And you can go back to, the sort of the 70s, and that, kind of American regional cuisines that are being discovered, the foods of the new South, that new Southern cooking that's become so hugely
Mm-hmm.
popular, that there's just there's just that's really taking off, and I think it's partly it's just kind of how the United States, like every other society, is kind of positioning itself in this, now that we recognize food as being not just, French cuisine that people eat in these fancy restaurants, but that every country has its own cuisine, and sort of it becomes a big part of the tourist economy, and
Mm-hmm.
hopefully one of these days soon, people will be going back to restaurants.
Oh gosh. But you do hear that, right? When you visit a place. Oh, you want real, authentic Mexican food? You go there. You want real fried chicken in the South? You go there. Real barbecue? I mean, those are our conversations when we're traveling about.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think we could replace the word real with good, and it would, I mean, it doesn't have to meet some particular person's idea of what real food should be. I think we should just say, I want good barbecue. I want good tacos. I want good whatever it is, right? I mean, there are lots of things that we should be asking about our food, and I think authenticity is not necessarily the one. And really, the reason we say real, the reason we say authentic, is because it's a sort of a reflection of our ignorance. We don't know what Mexican food is supposed to be, and that's okay. I mean, unless you've either grown up eating it, or you've dedicated your life to researching it, like some
like
crazy
Jeffrey
people.
Pilcher.
You don't really know what it is, and so obviously there's a lot of stuff out there that
Mm.
whether it's good or not is one particular version of it, and I think that so yeah, so I think that absolutely that desire for something that's I don't want to say real, but I do want to say, to understand the varieties of cuisines that are out there, is a natural impulse, and one that I think is now being embraced,
Yeah.
as legitimate and wonderful.
That's fair. I think, for me, I grew up in South Carolina, so when I want barbecue, I want barbecue that my grandpa used to cook. So I understand that. It's not necessarily that it's real, but it's what grandma used to make. That's what I want. That kind of.
Well, and that's just it, right? Because, I mean, there's at least three different main schools of South Carolina barbecue, right? And if you just happen to be in, like, not the yellow sauce, but anyway, I mean, I don't want to get into the details. I lived in South Carolina for a while too.
Oh, yeah, Charleston,
But
right? You were in Charleston.
I did. And Charleston at a time when its restaurant scene was just exploding.
Ah,
It was so wonderful. Um, but the point here is that, if you say that your grandma's or your, kind of version
mm-hmm.
of barbecue is the only one, it's the real one, then all those other people who, I mean, those are fighting words.
I was just gonna say that. Those are fighting words because our version of barbecue is the real stuff, Jeffrey.
Well, and
No,
I'm not going to argue with you because I don't want to pick a fight.
no,
But
no.
the
You are
that's
right. You are right. It's sort of it's almost invalidating what they're doing. It's saying theirs isn't real. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Also, P.S. I can make a mean shrimp and grits. Mean. Yeah. Just throwing that out there, everyone. Let's get back to Mexican food because you said something with a lot of us, we're really just sort of ignorant. That makes a lot of sense. To you, in your brain, what is a really good plate of Mexican food? What does that look like for you?
so there are so many different ones, but one that I really like is Verdolagas. It's purslane. It's this little succulent green thing. It actually grows wild on the streets of Toronto and in so many other places. Um, yeah, but on the streets of Toronto, you do not harvest that stuff and take it home. I actually once tried planting it, and it's better to buy at the grocery store, although you can't. But anyway, so purslane is this. It's a weed, and they cook it up in a green sauce with pork, and it's just down home cooking. And it's not on anybody's list of best of Mexican foods, but it's one of those things that just for me, I love it.
Spell purslane for me.
It's Purslane, and in Spanish it's called Verdolagas, Verdolagas.
Okay. And it's comparable to what? This weed.
Yeah, so it's a little succulent. So it's got these little, kind of penny-sized leaves, and they're kind of little. I mean, they're not flat. They have a little texture to them, a little
Mm-hmm.
substance to them. It's actually, I mean, people put them in salads. There's lots of stuff they do. It. You can probably find them if you look for them, and there's lots you can do with them. But it just a simple green sauce, with some, tomatillo and green chili and kind of a little pork broth, and
Mm.
I just partly it's something you find it's like more like home cooking than and so I really like it. But that doesn't mean that there aren't 16 other dishes
Sure.
that are equally Mexican food. It's just that one that for me it just has pleasant memories.
My very best friend in college, her dad's from the Basque Country, and her mom was from Mexico. And grandma made salsa verde con carne, and I had
Mhm.
never eaten anything like that in my entire life. And it was one of those like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then her dad would make lamb all the time. My first time, right? And the authentic like Basque, my mouth is watering. The Basque way of roasting lamb with just huge chunks of potatoes and carrots. And I'm just thinking to myself, wow, this is like it just really opened my eyes to cuisine.
Yeah.
So amazing. I do have a question for you. My husband's a firefighter, and we are right. And so there's this story out there in the 1960s in the Mission District in San Francisco. There was what's called the Mission Burrito. Firefighters down the street from this, what they thought was a sandwich shop, but I'm assuming it was like a Mexican restaurant. The owner said, I don't have sandwiches, but I could probably come up with something. Put two tortillas together, filled them with stuff, and the firefighters, of course, ate them because they're firefighters, and then they came back every single day and wanted burritos. Is there any legitimacy to this, the Mission Burrito?
I have to tell you, there's so many of these stories. I
Mm-hmm.
like to think of them as Earl of Sandwich stories. That it took an earl to invent the idea of putting, you had to be a nobleman to really, think that, oh, I could take bread, I could put something on it, and I could eat it. No, I mean, these are the kinds so there's a basic human desire to understand our past and to kind of enshrine founding
Hmm.
fathers. That we want to know the origins of things. I mean, this is, cosmology. This is the Garden of Eden. This is, all of these stories that human beings tell ourselves to kind of situate ourselves, within the universe and society and all these kinds of things. And it's as true of burritos as it is for anything else, right? That we want to know these origin stories.
For sure.
And, whether it's an English earl playing cards or San Francisco firefighters or whoever it may be, right? I mean, there's just this desire to say, I'm less interested in, the necessarily the truth of any of these stories, as in what the stories do for us and why. Why is it that the Mission Burrito has been described as the largest fast food item known to man? I mean, the burrito has it's a wonkin' thing.
Yeah.
And, and in a society where many of us eat too much, and kind of there's this, I think that maybe the Mission Burrito was kind of on the leading edge of that sort of supersizing things. And I mean, obviously there were burritos that were, this wasn't like something that they invented for the first, that the burrito was not around until the 1970s. I mean, that's just not
Right.
true. But it is interesting the ways that we tell these stories and the ways that we really we want to believe these stories. That I think it tells us something about the importance of food in our lives and the ways in which we kind of tell these stories to to understand our history, our past.
It's romantic.
It is. It's absolutely romantic. And I mean, firefighters. I mean, why not?
Exactly. You also edited the Oxford Handbook of Food History. What does that mean?
So that's really just a big scholarly volume that was trying to, at the time, and it's now almost, well, it's 8 years old, 9 years old, something like that. Get a sense for where the field was, because it's really been, it was so late. It was the 90s before a lot of these people who were kind of that first generation of food historians, taken seriously in scholarly positions and using scholarly approaches to the history of food. And so it was just trying to bring together some of those folks and say, where are we now and where do we need to keep going? And I have to say that, I mean, if somebody were to go back, not me, but if somebody were to go back and redo this, it would look very different today because, in those that decade since it came out, almost, there's been so much fascinating work and so many new directions that we're going on that. But I mean, in works like that, and really my own research now that it's kind of starting to acquire a patina of age, I like to think that that's kind of where I was at the time, and if I were redoing it today, I would do it differently. But that I'd like to think that I mean that these scholarly books are part of a conversation,
right?
And and if you're just kind of picking one up, you don't necessarily see that conversation happening. But as you sort of dig into more of them, you see the ways that scholars are talking to each other and sort of bouncing ideas off each other, and that's how knowledge moves forward. That's I mean, the scientists do the same thing, and so in a lot of stuff that I wrote 20 years ago, I'm just kind of cringe when I think about it. But I mean, that's where I was at the time. So.
Yeah, I hear you. I see old stories that I've reported on when I was used to be blonde, and it's like ugh, don't show me that. Gross. Are you teaching right now?
Yeah, well, we have just started back to school. I happen to be on, I'm not teaching this semester, I various reasons. So, but yeah, I am teaching, but not at the moment.
As a professor of food history, I'm super curious, who's in your class?
All kinds of people. Really. So I teach the undergraduate teaching campus I teach at is in Scarborough. And
Hmm.
Scarborough is like the leading immigrant receiving center in all of North America. Our students speak like 90 different languages. Scarborough is one of the most diverse cities in all of North America and all of the world.
Wow.
And we get people from everywhere. And I got to say, as a food historian, that is so exciting for me
I
because
bet.
first of all, back when restaurants were actually open, like every day after class, I would go to a different restaurant. I would be like, oh my God, this is like I had no idea what this was, but it was like so good. And but then my students, they're from these same families, communities, and I am learning so much from them that I had no idea about. I mean, Mexican food, actually, we have very few immigrants in Toronto from Mexico. We get them from, like seems like everywhere else. But and actually, I get to say that moving to Toronto, one of my big regrets is that the Mexican food is not, frankly, better. We have wonderful, food from China and India and Africa and everywhere, but not so much Mexico.
That's a bummer for the guy who wrote Planet Taco. Big bummer.
It is, but I mean, yeah, I still I can cook at home. So
Okay, good. There you go. There you go. I do want to wrap up a little bit. I have a couple more questions. Do you consider yourself a foodie?
yeah, yeah, I do. Well, actually, so I like to think of it as a foodist. Kind of like a Buddhist. So
I like that. Oh, that's good. I'm going to write that down. Do you consider yourself a food snob?
no, I don't. I mean, I like good food, but I don't think that you have to go to these kinds of temples of gastronomy to eat well. I like home cooking,
Me too.
and so I mean, I think you can be a foodie without being a food snob.
Okay. I will work on that. I promise. Do you cook at home? Are you a
Yeah,
cook?
I'm not gonna, no shaming. I mean, if you just, life is short. You should eat well. And so, I really, I don't think we should be shaming anyone over what they eat.
Okay.
Well,
I don't do that, but I do consider myself a food snob. I try not to be. Um, do you cook at home? Are you a good cook?
absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I am. I'll just say it. I'm a good cook.
I say it. I own it. I'm a good cook. What's your favorite thing to make at home?
Favorite thing to make at home. Actually, I have a lot of things, but I mostly actually am in an Italian kitchen, and so I make a pretty good pizza.
Fantastic. I love that. Let's talk about this. I read this somewhere that you are working on a couple of projects. One of them is world history of beer over the last
Yep.
200 years. You still working on that, or
No,
is
it's actually over all of history. Yeah, I'm starting with the beginnings of fermentation thousands of years ago. But its focus is mostly on the spread of industrial beer around the world.
gotcha. Fermentation, I feel like, is something that's fairly trendy right now. We're just fermenting
Oh,
everything.
absolutely.
And
But it's one of those things that fermentation, humans have been, I mean, well, fermentation happens naturally, and humans
mhm,
have been eating fermented foods, as long as we've been human. So
right.
I think that it's kind of like rediscovering kind of old school stuff, which in an age of industrial processed food, kind of getting back to that real stuff is deeply appealing,
It's
although problematic.
a thousand percent. What are you learning about beer? I have a very small knowledge of beer. I love it, but it was one of those. Correct me if I'm wrong, but instead of what there was something You just tell me. So what are you learning about?
Yeah,
What are you learning
so
about
I
beer?
mean, one of the things about beer is that so Pilsner beer, that basic Budweiser, Corona, Molson, Heineken, all of these things are one particular style of beer. And it took off in the 19th century. It was kind of like white bread, this kind of, which was deeply appealing if you didn't have, if you had hard bread and all that stuff. And it's really only when beer actually stops being skanky that we can kind of go back and rediscover the pleasures of IPA or
Yeah.
wild fermentation and stuff like that. It's only when we can reliably get beer that's pure and reasonably under control, that we sort of want to pursue these extreme beers that have become super trendy.
Hmm.
uh, and but for a lot of people, having reliably clean fresh beer was actually a good thing, and there's a reason that Pilsner became so popular. And it's only in this kind of postmodern era, when we're not worried about our beer going bad, that we're rediscovering these old traditions.
I think what I was getting at before was that beer didn't spoil when you were traveling, across, miles and miles and miles of ocean. That was the one thing that sort of stayed good on the ship. Is that, no? That's not accurate.
Now, distilled liquor, wine actually keeps much better than beer. Um, yeah, no, beer can go skunky.
I
I mean,
believe.
if you before refrigeration, beer, the higher your alcohol content is, the better it's going to keep.
Right.
And beer is relatively low.
Exactly.
And when you start going beyond, like, kind of Western brewing traditions, so Mexico had this native beer called pulque,
Hmm.
which was actually the fermented agave sap, the same thing they make tequila out of. They distill it, and they make pulque. That stuff was so rank. And actually, it's enjoying this revitalization these days, because you can actually make sure that it's refrigerated and stays fresh, and you're not going to get something that's really nasty. But
Ranky and
I mean,
skanky.
exactly. I'll be honest with you. There's all of this sort of desire to recover, natural foods from the past, and kind of, if your grandmother wouldn't recognize it as food and all that stuff.
Hmm.
But a lot of that food, I mean, there's a reason people went to industrial food, because a lot of it, was kind of like uh,
Hmm.
bad.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. So where are you in this project?
I'm hoping to finish up the manuscript this year. Books take longer. I mean, basically, I started this the minute the other book came out, which is to say, what that was 8 years ago, 9 years ago. I want it to be. I don't want there to go more than a decade before my big books come out, and so I want it out by 2012 or 2022.
Okay. Okay.
So that's my goal.
Well,
See
good
if we
luck
get
with
there.
that. Yeah, good luck with that. You've been drinking a lot of beer or just reading about
I
it?
have,
Okay.
and I mean, for like, in college, I drank beer because
Uh-huh.
that's what one does. And then in Mexico, you drink beer because, again, that's what one does. And so I was actually kind of late coming to this whole, kind of craft beer phenomenon. But I've been trying to make up lost ground, and I've actually really come to love, all of these spontaneous fermented, wild flavors and sour beers and all that kind of stuff. Um, but again, I recognize that this is not, like going back to the Middle Ages, and I mean that these are modern beers,
Right.
and yeah.
Well, come on out to Oregon because this is a beer mecca, especially
Absolutely.
those craft brewers. I really did turn into, talk about beer snob. I turned into a major beer snob when I moved to Oregon, but there's a lot of good beer around here.
There absolutely is.
Okay, Professor, we're going to wrap up a little bit. You've taught me so much in the last, hour, I guess. I want to get to the final three. Best advice you've ever been given?
Best advice I've ever been given. Do what you want to do. Don't let, kind of expectations guide you.
Man, that's good. Who gave you that?
I don't even remember, but it sunk in.
Okay, that's great advice for 2021, isn't it? Do what you want to do.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that. What's your happy place?
My happy place. Actually, the kitchen. The kitchen is a very happy place. It's easy for me to say this, right? I never raised a family, trying to put food on the table for picky young kids. But for me, cooking is just like this enormously relaxing place, and I recognize why many people don't have those same kind of happy associations, but it's absolutely a happy place for me.
Yeah, any warm.
That beach.
That and the beach?
Yes.
Nice. I was going to say any warm kitchen where good food is being cooked is always my happy place. Right? Okay. Final meal, final drink. What would that look like?
Wow, final meal. Well, actually, I would hope that my final meal is like when I'm 100 years old and it's some kind of a drip. And, but that's, actually, no, I don't want to have a drip. I guess in a way I want to be 100 when I die, but still eating, like Verdolagas and drinking some pulque. That I guess would be my final meal, final drink would be, kind of, but not for a while.
Okay. Yeah.
But
we'll give it some time.
Yeah, I guess it would be.
Especially, we got to get this book out first. So. Yeah, okay. Jeffrey, where can people find your books? I mean, I found them everywhere, but they're available all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, if there are still bookstores out there, maybe you can find one there. And I mean, I lament the growing loss of just kind of small retailing, and but then I mean, a lot of things that you want are only available through other means, and so
hit up your local bookstore first. Then after that, if you don't find Jeffrey Pilcher's books, you can head online. We'll allow it this one time. Thank you so much. You've been so much fun. I feel like this hour just flew by. If you'd like to watch this podcast, you can do so at ktvl.com or on YouTube. Just search Off Script with Trish Close, and you can listen to it wherever you like to listen to podcasts. One more time, Professor Jeffrey Pilcher, thank you so much for looking into the origins of food. It is fascinating.